Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you would like to become a patron of the podcast, then pop along to patreon.com/The History Network to find out how to become a patron there. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 30, Episode 6, Days of Valour, Part 1. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast. Throughout the Indian Mutiny of 1857 to 1858, a total of 182 Victoria Crosses were awarded. More than one-third of those were awarded for actions in the city of Lucknow. It is a place with which anyone who studies the history of military bravery should be intimately familiar. One of the most remarkable actions during the part of the conflict was the relief of Lucknow on November the 16th, 1857. Many modern accounts of the actions which took place on that day state that 24 Victoria Crosses were awarded in a single day. Whilst the actions which occurred on that day are indeed remarkable, full of bravery of the highest order, the number of Victoria Crosses actually awarded is somewhat less, at only 17. There were, however, a group of Victoria Crosses awarded for bravery during the entire period of the relief, from November 14th until November 22nd, which may be included. This makes the relief of Lucknow the single most awarded action in British military history. The defence of Rorke's Drift during the Zulu Wars in January 1879 ranks second with 11 Victoria Crosses awarded for actions undertaken there, although that is equal to the number of Victoria Crosses awarded for events at Lucknow on September 25th, 1857, during the first relief of the city. The number of Victoria Crosses awarded for actions at Lucknow during 1857 is enormous, however, with a total of 66 of the medals received during the Indian Mutiny awarded for actions performed there. The Indian Mutiny broke out on May 10th, 1857, when the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry, stationed at Meerut, mutinied over the court-martialling and imprisonment of 85 men for refusing the cartridges for their Enfield P53 rifles. These cartridges used tallow, rumoured to be from beef and pork, and as such were deeply offensive to men of both the Hindu and Muslim faiths. This was only one of the tensions in India which had been building for some time, and there were several incidents prior to May which foreshadowed the mutiny. Nothing was done to ease the concerns these incidents and conflicts revealed, however. When the mutiny erupted, the sepoys and sowars of the troops stationed in Meerut killed their English officers and several civilians before heading to Delhi on May the 11th to acclaim the king of the city, Bahadur Shah Zafar, as Mughal emperor. Regiments stationed in Delhi joined the revolt, or they refused orders to shoot on the rebels. The mutiny quickly spread to other centres, and it spread further afield across the Bengal Presidency and to other states. When news of the events at Meerut and Delhi reached Lucknow, some 500 kilometres to the south-east, fortification work was begun on the buildings of the Residency complex, home of the British Resident General. This work began on May 23rd. The decision to fortify the Residency was taken by Sir Henry Lawrence, the newly appointed British Commissioner in the state of Oudh, which had been annexed by the British in 1856. Lawrence had only been in the position for 6 weeks, replacing Coverley Jackson, who had done little to assuage tensions in the area, but whose command had added to the grievances of the sepoys who had mutinied. Lawrence brought into the complex ample supplies, and civilians moved closer to the Residency from outlying areas. Lawrence had at his disposal troops from the 32nd Cornwall Regiment of Foot, stationed in Lucknow, loyal Indian troops, and some civilian volunteers. The regiment's commanding officer, Colonel John Inglis, would become the overall commander of the siege for most of its duration. Sepoy troops in Lucknow rebelled on May 30th, but were driven from the city by the 32nd. The towns surrounding Lucknow revolted in the first days of June, and by the 10th, British control on Oudh had vanished. On June 30th, Lawrence learned that the rebels were planning an attack, and he personally led a foray against them. This was poorly organised, and some of the sepoys under Lawrence's command defected. Others remained loyal and performed many acts of bravery to save their British companions in the days to come. Lawrence and his men retreated into the Residency, and the siege began. The British controlled several buildings and had trenches and emplacements which covered around 60 acres of ground. Lawrence had 855 British soldiers and officers, 712 loyal Indian troops, 153 civilian volunteers, as well as more than 1,200 non-combatants, including women and children. The force that opposed them consisted of 8,000 sepoys and several hundred locals. The rebels had several modern pieces of artillery, but they lacked a unified command. Nonetheless, the rebels began to bombard the Residency and cause casualties. Both the damage caused and the solidity of the Residency buildings can be seen in the ruins visible today. The danger posed by those modern guns is also shown in the number of awards for bravery made to men who undertook to spike the enemy guns and put them out of action. Lawrence refused to demolish the palaces and mosques adjacent to the Residency, and these provided the rebels with many excellent positions to shoot upon the defenders. An attack was repulsed on July the 1st, but on July 4th, Lawrence died of wounds he had sustained. Colonel Inglis of the 32nd then took overall command. As well as casualties sustained by enemy fire, disease began to take its toll among the defenders. During the siege from June 30th until September 25th, 4 Victoria Crosses were awarded for actions undertaken by members of the 32nd. As with many other Victoria Crosses, recommendations for the award were made for a combination of actions on different dates. Many of the Gazette entries for the Victoria Crosses awarded at Lucknow were made much later, from mid-1858 onwards, and so a picture of all of the medals awarded during the siege did not appear for some time, despite the notoriety of the siege itself in the British papers. On June 30th, Corporal William Oxenham rescued a member of the Bengal Civil Service from a collapsed veranda and was exposed to enemy fire for 10 minutes. On July 4th and 9th, and again on September 27th, Private William Dowling exposed himself to danger in spiking enemy guns. The men accompanying him on each of these sorties died later, and so when the award was gazetted in November 1859, Dowling was the only man still alive. At the time, the Victoria Cross was not awarded posthumously. The first posthumous awards would only be made in 1902. On July 7th, Lieutenant Samuel Hill Lawrence was the first to climb a ladder into a house suspected of being mined, and later of leading a sortie to capture an enemy gun. His citation referred to a second sortie made on September 26th. Captain Henry Gore Brown led a sortie to spike enemy heavy guns and was the first into the enemy battery on August 21st. On at least one of these occasions, the suggestion was made that the subsequent action be considered for a bar to the Victoria Cross. These were rejected since the recipient had not already been awarded the medal, and so both actions would be considered for a single award. The first bar to a Victoria Cross would come during the First World War. Several recipients' citations included actions on dates relatively far apart, but included to be considered for a single award. Lieutenant Robert Aitken of the 13th Bengal Native Infantry was later awarded the Victoria Cross for undertaking various acts of gallantry from June 30th all the way through to November 22nd. Several of his actions are highlighted, occurring on July 3rd, August 20th, September 25th and 26th, and on September the 29th. During the siege and before final relief could get through, brave acts continued on a day-to-day basis. On July 16th, Cawnpore, some 75 kilometres from Lucknow, was recaptured by Major General Henry Havelock with a force of 1,500 men. This force consisted of detachments from various regiments, the 64th, 78th Highlanders, 84th, 90th, 5th, and members of the Madras European Fusiliers. Cawnpore had been the scene of a massacre of British forces by the rebels, led by Nana Sahib, on June 27th. 4 men survived, one of whom, Lieutenant Henry George Delafosse, joined the garrison at Lucknow. 200 women and children were taken prisoner, but on July 15th, as Havelock approached, their murder was ordered. The atrocity would fuel retribution and reprisals for the remainder of the mutiny. Havelock decided to try and relieve Lucknow on July 20th, but in order to do so he had to cross the Ganges River. His relief force consisted of men from the 64th, 84th, 78th, 1st Madras Fusiliers, Ferozepur Sikhs, European Volunteer Cavalry, and a battery of Royal Artillery. This expedition took time and many men fell sick. On July 29th, Havelock's men fought and won a battle at Unnao across the Ganges, but they were still 60 kilometres from Lucknow. Although victorious, Havelock's fighting effectiveness was reduced to only 850 men, and he did not attempt to advance further. At Unnao, Sergeant Major George Lambert performed the first of the actions for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross. Havelock received reinforcements and won another engagement on August 4th, but was again too weak to press on. On August 16th, Havelock was able to force Nana Sahib's troops to retire at Bitour and to burn Nana Sahib's palace, but Havelock still needed to retire to Cawnpore to deal with a renewed rebel threat to the town. George Lambert performed the second action mentioned in his citation at Bitour on August 16th. This initial failure of Havelock's relief expedition led to many more local Indian landowners joining the rebels at Lucknow. Estimates of the exact numbers of rebels there have always varied widely, some reports placing their number at 30,000, some at 60,000. Whatever the reality, the defenders at Lucknow were vastly outnumbered. The greatest advantage that the defenders had was that the Sepoy rebels still had no unified command. At Cawnpore, Havelock was replaced in command by Major General James Outram, who arrived with reinforcements on September 15th. Outram had written to Inglis telling him to cut his way out of Lucknow and make his way to Cawnpore. Inglis rejected this proposal as he had too few troops and too many non-combatants sick and wounded. At the Residency, the rebels dug mines under the foundations while the defenders dug countermines. A new relief force for Lucknow was organised, and this would be led again by Havelock, but accompanied by Outram, who waived his seniority. The force had 3,179 troops, 3 artillery pieces and 168 cavalry. More than 2,000 of the troops were British. In addition to the regiments of the 1st Relief were added units from the 5th and 90th Regiments, some Indian irregular cavalry and an additional battery. This relief force advanced towards Lucknow and the rebels did not stand against them. On September 21st, during the advance, Lieutenant William Rennie of the 90th Regiment of Foot was awarded the Victoria Cross for leading a charge by the regiment's skirmishers towards an enemy gun emplacement. His citation mentions further bravery on the 25th. By September 23rd, the relief force was almost within 6 kilometres of the Residency. By then, however, the heat of summer, several fatalities among the defenders and the relief force had been due to heatstroke, had made way for the monsoon rains. The relief force fought through the heavily defended streets of the city and pressed on, fearing that the defenders were too weakened to delay. The siege had by then reached its 87th day and the defenders' strength had been reduced to 982 men fit to fight from 1,720. The relief force made a final rush to the Residency on the 25th and lost 535 men getting through. 2 of those men, Abraham Bulger and Patrick Milot, skirmishers from the 84th Regiment of Foot, were later awarded Victoria Crosses for their continuous gallantry under heavy enemy fire in every action from July 12th until September 25th. The events of September 25th to 27th at Lucknow resulted in a further 14 Victoria Crosses being awarded, 8 for actions on the 25th, 5 on the 26th, and a further 1 on the 27th. These were in addition to the further actions of Bulger, Milot and Rennie on the 25th and Dowling on the 27th. Havelock's force consisted of 6 British battalions, 1 Sikh battalion, 3 artillery batteries and a very limited number of cavalry. Men of the 84th, 78th and 90th Regiments made up the relief force along with the 1st Madras European Fusiliers and elements of the Bengal Artillery and the Royal Regiment of Artillery. Members of all of these units would be awarded Victoria Crosses for their exploits. On the 25th, Private Joel Holmes of the 84th Regiment was awarded the Victoria Cross for volunteering to man a gun in Captain Francis Maud's Royal Artillery Battery, which had lost all its crew to wounds. Maud himself was awarded a Victoria Cross for continuing to operate his guns despite losing 1/3 of his crew. He was commended for the calm heroism of a true soldier who fully appreciates the difficulties and dangers of the task he has undertaken, and that, but for Captain Maud's nerve and coolness on this trying occasion, the army could not have advanced. Sergeant Major Lambert performed the last of his acts of outstanding conduct on the 25th. Lieutenant Herbert Macpherson of the 78th Highlanders set an example of heroic gallantry to the men of the regiment in capturing 2 9-pounder guns at bayonet point. Captain William Olferts of the Bengal House Artillery was awarded the Victoria Cross for bringing up limbers to carry off 2 captured enemy guns after they had been captured by the 90th Regiment. Olfert's actions were commemorated in other ways too. His battery, 56, was later incorporated into the Royal Regiment of Artillery and awarded his name in their title, becoming 56 Olfert's Battery Royal Artillery. Surgeon Joseph G. was awarded the Victoria Cross for tending wounded of the 78th Highlanders during the 25th and evacuating them towards the Residency. Whilst trying to reach the Residency with the wounded on the evening of the 25th, G was besieged in one of the buildings outside the complex. There he continued to dress the wounds of the men who defended the position all through the night. He proceeded with the wounded to the Residency through a crossfire of musketry the following morning. Assistant Surgeon Valentine McMaster was also awarded a Victoria Cross for tending the wounded of the 78th Highlanders, although the citation does not make it clear if his and G's actions were in the same place or at the same time. They were gazetted separately, McMaster's coming in 1858, G's not until 1860. On the night of September 25th and into the 26th, Private Henry Ward of the 78th Highlanders was awarded the Victoria Cross for staying beside the Dooley of Captain Henry Havelock, 10th Regiment, Deputy Assistant Adjutant General Field Force, who was severely wounded. Ward ensured that Havelock and a Private Pilkington were carried safely through a hail of musketry to the Residency on the morning of the 26th. The bravery continued on the 26th. Private Thomas Duffy of the 1st Madras European Fusiliers ensured that a 24-pounder gun did not fall into the hands of the rebels, while Private James Hallowell of the 78th directed the defence of a house in Lucknow besieged by rebel sepoys. Hallowell persuaded 9 of his colleagues to maintain a spirited defence. In another besieged house in Lucknow, Private Peter McManus of the 5th Regiment and Private John Ryan of the 1st Madras European Fusiliers defended the building from sepoy attacks. Both men also rushed into the street to rescue the wounded Captain Arnold of the 1st Madras European Fusiliers, bringing him safely into the house. In addition, Ryan distinguished himself throughout the day by his intrepidity and especially devoted himself to rescuing the wounded in the neighbourhood from being massacred. Colour Sergeant Stuart Macpherson of the 78th Highlanders was awarded his medal for rescuing a private of his company who was lying wounded in an exposed position and under heavy enemy fire. Macpherson also showed coolness and gallantry in action. Within the Residency, action continued into the 27th. Private William Dowling performed the second action for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross, spiking yet another enemy gun under heavy enemy fire. On the same day, Bombardier Jacob Thomas of the Bengal Horse Artillery was returning from a sortie when he came across and then carried a wounded soldier of the 1st Madras European Fusiliers to safety. Outram and Havelock's relief plan had been to evacuate the Residency, but the reduction in strength of both the defenders and now the relief force meant that, even combined, they were too weakened to evacuate Lucknow successfully. All they could do effectively was reinforce the Lucknow garrison. Outram also discovered that the Residency had had enough stores laid in by Lawrence to last the new enlarged garrison at least 2 months. Inglis had not known about these stores and had in fact feared that the defenders were on the brink of starvation. It seems impossible to believe that Lawrence had informed Outram by letter of the supplies he had gathered, but had not informed Inglis, but this seems to have been the case. As he outranked Inglis, Outram took command of the defence, and the defended area was enlarged, incorporating several of the surrounding palaces, including the Chittor Munzil to the south-east. The rebels, rather than be disheartened by the relief, redoubled their efforts, continuing musket and artillery fire into the defended area and digging mines under the foundations. The defenders continued to dig countermines and mounted sorties against rebel outposts. This style of fighting continued for 6 weeks. Meanwhile, Delhi had been retaken from the rebels on September 21st, and the loyal troops there then moved on to Agra and then Cawnpore. The commander, Major General James Hope Grant, was strictly enjoined by the new Commander-in-Chief in India, Sir Colin Campbell, not to attempt a relief of Lucknow itself until Campbell himself arrived. Campbell had been appointed to his position in July 1857. He had arrived in Calcutta in August, spent the next 2 months preparing, and by October was ready to fight his way up the main trunk road. Campbell arrived at Cawnpore on November the 3rd and, leaving an 1,100-man garrison behind, advanced towards Lucknow with 3,500 infantry, 600 cavalry and 42 artillery pieces. Ships of the British Navy had sailed for Calcutta from Hong Kong, and once they had arrived, their crews disembarked, and their marines and crews formed a 250-man naval brigade armed with ships' guns. This force fought its way through to Campbell and joined him for the relief. At the Residency, acts of bravery continued. On October the 2nd, Private Patrick Mchale was the first man at the capture of the guns located at the mutineer position of the Cawnpore Battery to the southwest of the Residency complex. Mchale's citation also notes actions on December 22nd, 1857, when again he was the first man to take possession of an enemy gun. His Gazette entry further notes that, on every occasion of attack, Private Mchale has been the first to meet the foe, amongst whom he caused such consternation by the boldness of his rush as to leave little work for those who followed to his support. By his habitual coolness and daring and sustained bravery in action, his name has become a household word for gallantry among his comrades. On October the 6th, Lance Corporal John Sinnott, in company with 2 sergeants and a private, went to the rescue of Lieutenant Gibbout, who lay wounded outside the complex. Sinnott had earlier accompanied Gibbout, carrying water out to the breastwork around the Residency to extinguish a fire. As October came to a close, the Residency at Lucknow was still under siege, but already vast numbers of heroic and selfless acts had been performed. The garrison, with its huge numbers of women and children, still had supplies for some time, but they faced a determined, if disunified, opposition. Help was coming, and the acts of bravery would only increase. Join us in a couple of weeks for part 2 of this epic 2-parter written by Murray Darm. Once again, if you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, please just pop along to patreon.com/The History Network. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barr.